In one of Manchester's most affluent postcodes, a man lived the kind of life most people only see through glass and screens. Multi-million-pound homes. High-end vehicles parked behind gated driveways. Foreign travels documented in glossy photographs. On paper, it was the story of a successful businessman who had mastered the system. But British authorities would later argue that none of it was real. Because while banks approved mortgages and estate agents closed deals, law enforcement was quietly asking a very different question: where did the money actually come from? This is the story of how a man accumulated more than £5 million in property, vast sums of cash, and digital wealth, without any legitimate income to explain it. A story that moves from luxury homes in Greater Manchester to encrypted phones, false documents, and a criminal operation that prosecutors said touched drugs, fraud, and large-scale money laundering. For years, investigators followed paper trails that didn't add up. Bank statements that told one story. A lifestyle that told another. And a growing suspicion that every purchase, every transaction, and every claim of success was part of something far bigger and far more serious than anyone around him realized. By the end of this case, a UK court would hand down a sentence so severe it sent a clear message about the scale of what had been uncovered. In this documentary, you'll see exactly how that illusion of success was built, how it was exposed piece by piece, and why the collapse of this empire reshaped how organized crime is pursued in the Northwest. Stories like this don't surface often, and when they do, most of the real details disappear into short news clips and forgotten articles. Without subscribing, you won't see how these cases truly unfold. Subscribe now! Greater Manchester, a vast metropolitan region in northwest England composed of 10 boroughs, each with its own identity. From the industrial legacy of Manchester City itself to affluent suburbs like Bowdon in Trafford, this region is a place of contrasts, thriving commerce, cultural vibrancy, and, beneath the surface, a long history of criminal networks that stretch beyond the city's borders. Into this world came Aram Sheibani, a man whose early life was shaped by migration and later defined by illusion. Sheibani was born on the 1st of September, 1980 and came to the United Kingdom from Iran with his family as a refugee in the mid-1980s. He was still very young, around 5 years old, when his family settled in this country, seeking safety and opportunity. As he grew up in the UK, Sheibani and his family became part of the city's diverse social fabric. However, unlike many refugees who build lives quietly within their communities, he would carve out a very different path. In his early adulthood he began presenting himself as a self-made entrepreneur. Over time, he cultivated a reputation, both locally and on social media, as a man of wealth, flair, and international connections, regularly photographed beside luxury cars, on yachts, and at exclusive destinations. Despite the outward image of success, official records showed that his declared income was sporadic and incomplete. Between 1999 and 2010, Sheibani only recorded his earnings on a handful of occasions, typically accompanied by documents that would later be proven forged, raising questions about the source of his rapidly increasing wealth. These inconsistencies were especially striking given the scale of his lifestyle. By his early 40s, Sheibani had acquired a portfolio of properties valued at around £5 million across the UK and Spain, accumulated high-end vehicles, and funded frequent travel to luxury destinations abroad. To the outside world, friends, neighbors, and local businesses, he appeared to be a successful international businessman. But behind that facade were financial records that raised deep suspicions among authorities, and a lifestyle that simply could not be justified by any legitimate business earnings. This is the backdrop against which everything that followed would unfold. By the time Aram Sheibani reached adulthood, he had already learned something essential about the world around him: appearance carried weight. In a society that rewarded confidence, paperwork, and presentation, he understood that success did not always need to be proven, it only needed to look convincing. Born in September 1980, Sheibani entered his 20s during a period when easy credit, property investment, and financial ambition defined a generation. It was an era where banks lent aggressively, documents were trusted, and the system relied heavily on what applicants declared about themselves. For someone willing to manipulate that trust, the opportunities were vast. On the surface, Sheibani positioned himself as an emerging entrepreneur. He spoke the language of business fluently: investment, assets, growth. He cultivated the image of someone who understood finance, property markets, and international commerce. To lenders, agents, and associates, he appeared informed, confident, and credible. But behind that image, official records were already beginning to fracture. Tax filings from the early 2000s show long stretches where no income was declared at all, punctuated only by occasional submissions that failed to explain any meaningful level of wealth. There was no established company producing profits, no verifiable salary, no trading history capable of supporting the lifestyle he was steadily constructing. The gap between what was being lived and what was being declared widened year after year. Rather than retreat, Sheibani adapted. Court findings would later show that during this period he began manufacturing the paperwork needed to sustain the illusion. Bank statements were altered to reflect balances that did not exist. Payslips were created to suggest employment that could not be traced. Financial documents were edited with precision, designed not to raise alarm but to satisfy the narrow checks required for loan approvals and mortgages. This was not reckless behavior. It was deliberate and incremental. Each successful application reinforced the method. Each approved mortgage validated the approach. Properties were acquired not as homes, but as symbols, physical proof that the image was working. Ownership conferred legitimacy, and legitimacy made the next transaction easier. In time, one acquisition led to another, creating the impression of momentum, of a businessman expanding his portfolio through skill rather than deception. At the same time, Sheibani became adept at distancing himself from direct financial exposure. Money moved through accounts not held in his own name. Associates and third parties appeared in paperwork where his presence might attract scrutiny. Transactions were structured to fragment responsibility, making it difficult for any single institution to see the whole picture. This period also marked a shift in how he presented himself socially. Travel became more frequent. Vehicles became more expensive. His public image leaned into success, not extravagance for its own sake, but controlled displays of achievement. Enough to command respect, enough to discourage questions. What makes this phase critical is not just what he was doing, but what he was learning. He learned which documents were examined closely and which were glanced over. He learned how little communication existed between institutions. He learned that confidence often replaced verification. Most importantly, he learned that the system assumed honesty, and that assumption could be exploited repeatedly without immediate consequence. There were moments where caution was required. Applications that demanded additional proof. Questions that arrived unexpectedly. But each time, he found a way forward, refining the process, tightening the presentation, correcting weaknesses before they became threats. To those watching from the outside, this looked like upward mobility. A refugee background transformed into financial success. A man navigating the system and winning. In reality, what was taking shape was a structure built on misrepresentation, one that required constant maintenance, increasing complexity, and absolute control over information. Every new asset added weight to the story, but also increased the risk that someone, somewhere, would notice the contradictions underneath. By the end of this phase of his life, Aram Sheibani had not simply acquired wealth. He had constructed an identity, one that depended entirely on deception continuing to work. And identities like that can survive scrutiny only for so long. By the time authorities began to understand the scale of Aram Sheibani's wealth, one conclusion became unavoidable: it was not the product of legitimate business activity. There were no trading records, no contracts, no verifiable enterprises capable of generating what he controlled. What investigators would later describe instead was a system designed to store, move, and conceal criminal proceeds. Properties played a central role in that system. Sheibani acquired high-value homes across Greater Manchester, London, and overseas, using them not only as assets but as secure environments. Places where money, devices, and sensitive materials could be held beyond casual scrutiny. These were not passive investments. They functioned as operational hubs, selected for privacy, access, and distance from one another. Inside these properties, police would later document large quantities of physical cash, often bundled and stored in ways consistent with organized criminal handling rather than personal savings. The sums were too large, too fragmented, and too deliberately concealed to be incidental. This was money meant to stay hidden, yet accessible. Alongside the cash were encrypted communication devices, phones designed to evade interception, commonly used within serious organized crime networks. These were not standard consumer devices. They were tools intended for coordination, discretion, and control, allowing communication without leaving conventional digital trails. Drugs were also present. Across different locations, investigators identified Class A substances, including cocaine, stored in quantities inconsistent with personal use. The positioning of these drugs, close to cash, devices, and secure storage, suggested a level of organization rather than opportunism. This was not sporadic involvement. It was structured, deliberate, and sustained. One London address alone illustrated the scope of what was being managed. Inside a secure safe, officers later recovered more than £160,000 in cash, alongside cryptocurrency recovery phrases and illegal drugs. The combination was telling. Traditional currency, digital wealth, and controlled substances were being handled in parallel, reflecting an operation that had adapted to modern enforcement pressures. Cryptocurrency formed a significant part of this system. Investigators would later identify approximately £1.5 million in digital assets, held across multiple wallets. These were not casual investments. Access details were carefully recorded and stored, indicating an understanding of how digital currency could be used to move value outside conventional banking oversight while still retaining control. Taken together, the material later seized across all linked properties painted a clear picture. Around £1.2 million in cash, held physically. A property portfolio valued at roughly £5 million, spanning multiple jurisdictions. And £1.5 million in cryptocurrency, secured through recovery keys and digital storage. What matters here is not just the amounts, but the diversification. Cash provided immediacy. Property provided legitimacy. Cryptocurrency provided mobility and distance from traditional oversight. Each element served a purpose, reinforcing the others and reducing reliance on any single method of storage or transfer. This phase of Sheibani's life was defined by confidence. Transactions continued. Assets accumulated. The structure held. But the more complex the operation became, the more traces it inevitably left behind, not obvious ones, but patterns. Repetition. Connections between locations. The same methods appearing again and again. What looked like control was, in reality, exposure slowly taking shape. By early 2019, investigators from Greater Manchester Police's Economic Crime Unit, working alongside specialists in organised crime, had reached a critical point. The financial contradictions surrounding Aram Sheibani were no longer theoretical. They were documented, cross-checked, and tied to specific assets. In April 2019, coordinated warrants were executed across multiple addresses linked directly to him, including high-value properties in Greater Manchester and London. These were not routine searches. They were the result of years spent analysing bank activity, mortgage records, company filings, and unexplained movements of money that could not be reconciled with any lawful income. As officers entered the properties, Sheibani attempted to intervene in the only way still available to him, by eliminating evidence. Encrypted phones were deliberately damaged. Devices were smashed, broken apart, and in some cases flushed down toilets in an effort to prevent recovery. This was not panic. It was a calculated attempt to disrupt the evidential chain investigators were building. But it was already too late. Despite the destruction, specialists recovered substantial material. Financial investigators secured banking data, mortgage applications, forged documents, and land registry records that mapped property ownership back to Sheibani. Each record reinforced the same conclusion: assets far beyond his declared means had been acquired through deception. Digital analysts worked alongside forensic accountants to reconstruct communication histories, financial flows, and ownership structures. Even where devices had been damaged, surrounding data, transaction logs, account links, and institutional records filled the gaps. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. Luxury homes were no longer symbols of success. They became exhibits. Cash stores became evidence of concealment. Cryptocurrency access details connected digital assets to physical locations. By the end of this phase, investigators were no longer asking whether criminal proceeds were involved. They were documenting how extensively the system had been used and how deliberately it had been hidden. These stories repeat because the details are forgotten. Sharing this keeps the pattern visible, and patterns are harder to ignore when they're seen clearly. The arrest did not come in a dramatic public chase or a sudden confrontation on the street. It came quietly, at one of the very properties that had helped sustain the illusion for so long. When officers arrived at the address linked to Aram Sheibani, the image he had carefully constructed began to collapse in real time. The luxury surroundings that once signaled success now framed a very different reality. Inside the property were the same elements investigators had been tracing for years. cash, documentation, devices, and materials that could no longer be explained away as coincidence or misunderstanding. At this point, there were no credible answers left to give. The financial explanations he had relied on no longer survived contact with the evidence. Mortgage applications contradicted tax records. Claimed earnings collapsed under scrutiny. The destruction of devices only reinforced the conclusion that concealment, not legitimacy, had been the priority. Sheibani was taken into custody as investigators moved to secure what remained of the operation. Properties were locked down. Assets were catalogued. What had once functioned as private space was converted into evidence, each room adding weight to a case that had already crossed the threshold from investigation to prosecution. Formal charges followed. Prosecutors laid out allegations that reflected not a single offense, but a sustained pattern of criminal behavior. Sheibani was charged with conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, offenses relating to fraud and forgery, money laundering, and perverting the course of justice, a charge directly linked to his attempts to destroy encrypted devices during police searches. Individually, each charge carried serious consequences. Taken together, they described a system built to acquire, move, and protect criminal wealth while actively obstructing those tasked with uncovering it. By the time the takedown was complete, the lifestyle that had once shielded Aram Sheibani now worked against him. Every asset became a question. Every document became a contradiction. And every effort to control the narrative ended the moment the evidence was laid out in full. The man who had lived as a successful entrepreneur now faced the full weight of the criminal justice system, not for how he appeared to live, but for how that life had truly been sustained. The case against Aram Sheibani moved to Manchester Crown Court, where it unfolded over 10 weeks. By this stage, the prosecution was no longer trying to prove a theory. They were presenting a structure, one built from financial records, recovered devices, forged documents, property trails, and the remains of evidence he had tried to destroy. Jurors were led step by step through the contradictions that defined his life. Tax records showing little or no declared income were set against mortgage applications claiming high earnings. Property acquisitions were traced back to falsified paperwork. Cash holdings were shown alongside communications and materials that tied those assets to organized criminal activity. What emerged in court was not a collection of isolated decisions, but a sustained course of conduct. Prosecutors argued that Sheibani had deliberately constructed a system designed to deceive banks, mislead authorities, and protect criminal proceeds over many years. Each offense reinforced the next, forming what the court described as a wide-ranging and deliberate criminal enterprise. The defense challenged elements of the prosecution's case, but the volume and consistency of the evidence left little room for doubt. By the end of the trial, the jury had heard how wealth was accumulated, concealed, and defended, and how that process relied on fraud, deception, and obstruction. On the 10th of June, 2021, the court delivered its verdict. Aram Sheibani was sentenced to 37 years in prison, a term that placed the case among the most serious organized crime convictions in the region. In passing sentence, the judge addressed not only the offenses themselves, but the motivation behind them, stating that Sheibani's greed had placed personal gain above legality, integrity, and the wider impact on society. The court made clear that the consequences of his actions extended far beyond Manchester, touching financial institutions, communities affected by drug supply, and the integrity of systems designed to protect the public. This was not a punishment for appearance or ambition. It was a judgment on sustained deception and on a life built around control of money at any cost. The case did not conclude with the prison sentence. In April 2024, the court ordered Aram Sheibani to repay £3.5 million identified as criminal benefit. The ruling carried a clear warning: failure to pay would result in a further 10 years in custody, extending an already exceptional sentence. Authorities described the confiscation process as complex, involving detailed analysis of property holdings, cash movements, and cryptocurrency linked to account and recovery data seized during the investigation. The work continued long after the trial, reflecting how modern organized crime extends beyond borders and into digital financial systems. Funds recovered through the proceedings are being directed back into public use, including community safety and crime reduction initiatives across Greater Manchester. It was a deliberate effort to return value to the communities affected by the activities that sustained Sheibani's lifestyle. What remains is a case that did more than dismantle one operation. It exposed how wealth can be engineered through deception, and how long it can take to fully unravel what that deception leaves behind. Cases like this raise a harder question than guilt or innocence, whether justice ends with a prison sentence, or with dismantling the systems that allow this kind of power to grow. If this story changed how you see wealth, power, and what hides behind them, like this video so these investigations don't disappear, subscribe if you want more breakdowns that expose what headlines leave out, share it with someone who still believes success always tells the full story, and comment your thoughts below, because if we stop questioning these systems, they keep producing the same outcomes.